Hi, this is Paul. We're going to continue our Brits in Short series. We had Douglas Murray distracting Bethel McGrew with his shorts on with Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot. And now we have the full calf appearance of David Fuller in this little film that someone pointed out to me. I hadn't watched it. I didn't. The algorithm didn't even serve it up to me, which sort of surprises me because the algorithms usually, if David does something, algorithm will pop it up. But I had never heard of this Other Life podcast or anything. It's a smallish channel, 14,000 subs. And so David is processing a bunch of the things about the end of Rebel Wisdom and the end of the IDW, and a lot of that is stuff that we've talked about before. But this little section really prompted something in my mind with respect to I don't think my sound is up high enough. Oh, looks okay. So let's go right ahead and play some of it.
Obviously, sort of deep in different kind of intellectual traditions, and there's something about the feedback loop of social media that I think is having an unexpected consequence of forcing people to constellate and kind of crystallize around their ideas and their ideology, and often like some of their worst ideas. Because you put it out there on social media, people criticize it, you end up defending it, so you build up your psychological attachment to something that maybe you should only have like 70% confidence in or 80% confidence in. So it seems that people crystallize their personality and their worldviews because they're forced to defend it, because this sort of tribalizing aspect comes in on Twitter as well. And it's like they kind of, so as social media works at the moment, it kills curiosity, it seems to kill growth, it seems to kill any opportunity for dialogue across the divides, because it's quite effectively tribalized, and those divisions between the tribes are viciously policed as well.
Now, when he said this in this interview, I was driving, I was running out to do some pastoral calls, and I immediately thought of the fact that one of the dynamics that happened in the United States is that people who immigrated to the United States weren't necessarily religious, came to the United States, and then very quickly participated often in immigrant congregations. It's also the case that other religions from the world that didn't necessarily have congregational models, when they came to the United States, they adopted congregational models. I live quite close to the 5 here that goes up north-south on the west coast, and if I drive down to Stockton, there's a crossover road in Stockton that drives across from 5 to 99, and then I'll go down to Ripon and all of those little CRC areas. But if you're driving through Stockton through this cross corridor, you pass a place that says Buddhist Church. And I remember the first time I saw that sign, I said, "Oh, wait a minute. Buddhists don't have church." Well, they do in America. Well, why? So this dynamic that David is talking about, I think, is something similar. It's something analogous to what happened when people would come to America, and it's a place of significant religious diversity. There's no state church in America. And what would happen is you would tend to have the congregationalization of the people and their groups. And you would tend to get a dynamic that would cohere the people into a congregation. And I think this is part of the reason that the United States has stayed much more participarily religious as opposed to many other Western developed countries. And because this observation in social media, I think, is essentially the same thing. But what we're seeing is sort of the coalescing of hyper churches in cyberspace. And because all of those same dynamics of policing, of basically gaining status with one another, gaining reinforcement, gaining community, all of that stuff happens on social media. But because it's on media and not in real life, where you have the much fuller engagement of life on life, all these aspects which tend to concretize and make more real all the aspects of one's life. Because this is happening in social media, you get these tiny little very short-lived hyper churches around one issue or another issue. And these hyper issues are basically living on Twitter or YouTube or some of these other things. And as David and his I forget the guy's name, is the name on the channel, Justin Murphy, as David and Justin Murphy talk about this, it's very much like congregational dynamics, but again, in a virtual online space, all of the dynamics are sped up, and they're also not tethered to all of the sort of normal constraints that in-person community has, which tends to normalize and regularize and sort of keep sane in a much broader way the people within it. And so you get these hyper little, very short-lived online churches. They're not really churches because they're not meeting in person, but they're all surrounding these certain ideas. And then all of those dynamics that David talked about, I shouldn't give him a hard time because of his shorts, because I'll tell you, that's probably something that most of you don't want to see either. But if it's sometime between May and November, I'm probably in shorts too. So it's just saying, David, I'm not trying to. Anyway, beyond the shorts. So listen again to what he just said, and then I'm going to let it play through a little bit more, because they're going to talk about these dynamics. And again, this is so much like congregationalization in America. But again, because it's on the internet, because it's sped up, because it's virtual, because it's unreal, because it doesn't have the sort of stickiness and traction that in real life things have, it's gonna create sort of these little abnormal, I don't know, are we going to call them egregores? They're going to create these things out there in the internet, but they're also going to be fairly short-lived because of the churn that's in all of this social media stuff. I mean, I'm listening to Vanderklay all the time, and then 3 months later, I never listen to Vanderklay anymore. I'm all into Jordan Peterson. No, I'm not into Jordan Peterson anymore. I'm on to all this other thing. So again, back to these dynamics.
Like if you see kind of social media, people criticize it, you end up defending it, so you build up your psychological attachment to something that maybe you should only have like 70% confidence in or 80% confidence in. So it seems that people crystallize their personality and their worldviews because they're forced to defend it, because this sort of tribalizing aspect comes in on Twitter as well. And it's like they kind of, so as social media works at the moment, it kills curiosity. It seems to kill growth. It seems to kill any opportunity for dialogue across the divides, because it's quite effectively tribalized, and those divisions between the tribes are viciously policed as well. If you see if you start to learn the landscape, you realize like how well established, and there's sort of different roles of people like policing the boundaries of various tribes, and all of that starts to come in. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. There is something about that feedback loop with social media that seems to just crystallize people into a kind of like they've assumed their final form in a way.
Well, I don't know if they assume their final form. I think it's actually a second self that is living online, that is coalescing into this, again, this sort of this hyper virtual church that sort of exists out there, and then before you know it, it's going to be gone, or it's going to morph into this next thing or something else.
And their final form gets more and more kind of reactive and.
Yeah, definitely. I think the mechanism that you're describing is something along the lines of this. It's like one's provocative ideas that draw a lot of polarization, draws haters, but also draws lovers. Those ideas are the ones that you get the most social media growth around, basically. And so in a way, if you say something on the internet that gets you a big burst of new followers, to keep growing, you have to respect that burst of new followers, or you won't keep growing. And so any social media platform is intrinsically gamified. Like, you want to see the number go up, right? That's what most social media are. They're like video games for adults where like the medium of the game is words. You type words in, or pictures or whatever. You know, it's like an adult video game. But ultimately, at the end of the day, most people just want to make their follower count go up. That's the video game, right? And so I think,
and I'll tell you, I mean, I haven't chased this too much, but just looking at your Google Analytics on your YouTube, or looking at the analytics on your Twitter, and are the numbers going up? And with YouTube, then it's even with the, you don't get big money with YouTube monetization, but if your channel gets big enough, then you can get sponsorships and all these other economic incentives. And he's exactly right about this. This is powerful psychological stuff. I would imagine it. I forget who David Fuller had this guy on. I mean, basically the same people that have sort of engineered casinos are engineering this thing to keep us in the game.
that's essentially what's happening in what you describe. It's that, because I've noticed this that like I've had a few, you know, kind of nuclear tweets over the years, and in those nuclear tweets you get a ton of haters, but you also get a ton of new followers. And it was very clear to me, it was always very clear to me, I could just choose for the next 6 months after one of those nuclear tweets to just keep saying stuff like that, throw as much red meat as possible to all those new people, right? And also piss off all the same people who are getting pissed off, who inadvertently share it even more, right?
And people, you know, people follow you to hate on you, and that's always what fascinates me about negative comments. I mean, Jordan Peterson will often talk about 98%, but that's nothing, because for the most part, the people watching your channel are already convinced, and they're sort of back for the same thing, and so you get relatively few hate comments. And so that's why I'm always rather amazed when someone is regularly in the comments section hating on me, because it's like, this is obviously feeding something in you, and it doesn't really bother me because YouTube comments are YouTube comments. But why would you watch a channel to hate on it? But, you know, I guess there are probably some channels that I keep a look at to hate on too, and then maybe even to hate on in doing a commentary on it. And so there's a lot going on in this thing.
And it was always clear that was a very available growth path. And if most people are just playing these things like video games, which they're basically trained by the platforms to do, then it makes sense from like an evolutionary game theory perspective that at the end, in the final equilibrium, the platform is only going to surface people who basically double down on those growth opportunities.
And you can very much see that in channels that grow. You know, somebody have a viral video that is attacking one side of the political equation or another, especially, or one side of the culture war. And if they're just really good at the one-liners and the takedowns and the owns and all of that stuff, just whoosh, up they go. And then you read the comment section, it's, you know, it's the Mooks and Knights dynamic all over again.
If you don't, and like I haven't, every time I've gone super nuclear on some provocative tweet, I set that aside for a little bit. I like stepped away from it. I talked about other things, right? Because I don't want to be like known.
And then there's the likes and the applause of doing the counter nuclear tweet, because that'll juice you too. I'm not like all of those other Twitter people who just are captured by their audience. I mean, and that's, you know, one of the dynamics in the church is that Tim Keller really speaks quite well about is I think self-righteousness. That self-righteousness is just this sort of intellectual, spiritual poison that you can just sip and sip and sip and sip, and it's perfectly articulated in Jesus. Well, so a lot of you won't know the parable, so I'll pull it out. To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you I am not like the other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. Lord, I thank you that I'm not like the Republicans. Lord, I thank you that I'm not like the Democrats. Lord, I thank you like I'm not Antifa. Lord, I thank you that I'm not like QAnon. I mean, just on and on and on you can play this game. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And this is another element of the Jesus spirit DNA that has got into our culture. But of course, you can gamify the other way too, and it's just the breastfeeding, and you can see that. I mean, part of what fascinates me about a video like this is it's like all of these dynamics are in the church, and you watch them play out constantly, and they've been playing out for centuries. But now with social media, you see these same human aspects now played out in the virtuality of social media, just in hyper speed and almost sort of in hyper contexts.
For one or two provocative tweets or whatever, it's not like what I'm obsessed with, so I don't want to be that guy forever. So I'd go on to other things, and
thank you that I'm not in audience capture. I go on to other things.
People could say this is just cope or whatever, but I'm not as big as I could be, because I write about all kinds of things, and I try my honest best to not really have a tribe. And I don't think it's cope. I think it's actually just honest and objective to say that, like, my audience could be much bigger if I just leaned harder into, if I decided to be like a Jordan Peterson fan and a Brett Weinstein fan and ally, and cozied up to all those guys early days, got them on my podcast early, and ingratiated myself in those communities and all. Like, you can do that, and you can grow faster that way. And I do pride myself a little bit on being a lone wolf, and I've never done that. But my point is not to talk about myself. My point is, I've seen, I think, and I do believe this is empirically valid, that there are just strong selection pressures in favor of doing more of that thing that is provocative. But the perversity of that is that often the thing that gets you growth is like a dumb idea or a bad idea,
and you have this classic preacher line: what you own them with, or what you lure them with. There's all sorts of different versions. Basically, what you attract them with is what you attract them to. And that's been true in churches forever. If this is the thing that they heard and said, "Oh, pastor, I want to come to your church. I'll be at your church every week. I'll give 1/10 of all I have. I'll do whatever you say, pastor." When someone comes into the church and is, the first Sunday in there, they're just crying, say, "Pastor, I've never heard a sermon like yours." It's like, 6 months from now, you're going to hate my guts, because you've just been projecting on me like mad all sorts of issues that you came in with. And once you finally discover that I'm not the person you thought I was, well, hell hath no fury like a congregation member scorned.
Or the most extreme idea or ridiculous ideas, and you end up doubling down the hardest on some of your weakest ideas. So that's how I think that is true. I think that is how it works. And so in the case of, so you talked a little bit about Peterson. What about Brett Weinstein? What was his trajectory, and where did he go wrong?
It's a difficult one to talk about, because Brett, I felt more of a kind of personal friendship with Brett.
And part of this dynamic too is you have these kind of breakdowns you get in churches too, obviously, all the time. And those of you who've been involved in churches know that members get disaffected, people get crossways because of things. COVID, I was talking to a colleague of mine for whom COVID was just a mess in his church. There were he has a significantly large church. There are significant loud portions of his church that were like, we're not going to put on masks, we're not going to shut down, we're not going to do anything different. And they wanted to sort of be like John MacArthur's church in Southern California taking the state to court. And okay, but that wasn't really going to be that kind of church. And basically the church council, which is how Christian Reformed churches operate, the church council basically took sort of a moderate approach, and they weren't shut down hardly at all, but they had a nice outside space that they could meet in, so they were meeting outside. And so they tried to do it, and then when the bad weather came, they decided to move inside. But then other people were just angry at the pastor because, "Pastor, you should have drew a hard line." And the pastor's like, "Hey, wait a minute, I've got a council here. This is a council decision. This isn't my decision." "No, pastor, if you were a good pastor." These things are in church all the time. But what's different about in church is that well, in some ways it's much harder because, well, the families know each other. I mean, you've had home groups, or you've been over to each other's house, or you're always at potlucks, or your kids play together, and all this. In the internet land, boy, it's easy to ghost somebody. You just disappear.
And we've done quite a lot of events together,
and I respect him a lot. Yeah.
I always did, and he's kind of part of the broader networks of a lot of the other people that we featured, and there was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes at the time when we had what amounted to a kind of.
And I know some of you don't like David Fuller because you're sort of on the Brett Weinstein side of things.
Falling out. And my main point was always trying to keep the dialogue open. And Brett, even to this day, has not hosted a single medical figure who contradicts the narrative that he's been putting forward about ivermectin and vaccines. And my feeling was that particular topic, the vaccines, the ivermectin, all of that stuff, that was one of the most heated areas of the culture, never really. It then blew up. I mean, ironically, it blew up with Joe Rogan only about 6 months afterwards, when he hosted some of the same people Brett had been hosting back in, I think, summer 21. And yeah, I don't really. It was difficult, and it's the difficult dynamics as well that no one really knows how to deal with. And you heard Sam Harris kind of addressing it a little bit as well. We don't really know what to do when our personal brand gets tied up with our. Like, we knew when we were in the media and institutions, we had some game rules.
You don't know what to do. You go on trigonometry and you talk about Joe Biden's son.
Understood some game rules. Now that we're all our own platforms and you've got personal relationships tied up with truth seeking, we don't know what to do.
And again, this is another space in which you have this in church all the time. It's hard. I mean, when you say you don't know what to do, it's like there are no easy answers. Well, that's right. There are no easy answers. And often it goes badly, and I'll tell you. But this is sort of the normal lay of the land in churches. And so then people are like, well, I'm going to stay away from churches because churches have these kind of things. Well, you're going to have these kinds of things in any truth-seeking community. And again, sort of what's happened is that the internet has sort of created spaces where you have these little hyper churches out there, and all of the same dynamics happen in them.
We don't know what to do. And I wasn't necessarily. I looked into some of the claims that particularly some of Brett's guests and Brett were making on ivermectin and vaccines, and they didn't seem to add up. But at the same time, that's not really the priority. The priority for me was, how do you create opportunity? Because if Brett was right about some of these are really important topics. If Brett's wrong, they're really important topics as well, like lives are at stake. And what do you do when one of your friends is putting out stuff that looks to me like he's putting lives at risk?
And again, as a pastor, I have relationships with all sorts of unsavory creatures. But when you have those relationships online, Peugeot made a really lovely comment in the video that I posted today, of where he had sort of the audience reactions to Peugeot. Really lovely comment about technology, because what this technology does is sort of increases power. So it's one thing when I have relationships with street people and murderers. I mean, part of Christian ministry has often been prison visits, and so you're spending time with murderers and rapists and child molesters, and that sort of goes with the package. If you're a pastor, you associate with these people, and of course it goes all the way back to Jesus, who of course was constantly criticized for associating with the wrong kind of people. And of course, as I've mentioned a lot, that in terms of a culture war, Christians should look to Jesus to figure out how to engage and how to walk through a culture war. And Jesus, again, was regularly criticized when people say, well, he associates with sinners and tax collectors, and again, in this parable, you had the tax collector. Well, the problem with a tax collector, if you're against the Roman occupation of God's holy people and God's holy land, the tax collector is a Roman collaborator, as is the prostitute. That's the moral problem with the prostitute in the Gospels. It's not that it's just a sense that, well, prostitution isn't a bad, prostitution isn't a good thing. Now, it's kind of funny. You get all the atheists talking about, well, there's not enough anti-slavery texts in the Bible to satisfy them. Well, there's also not a lot of anti-prostitutes texts in the Bible to satisfy them either. And that doesn't mean Christianity is somehow pro-prostitution, although prostitution has been with Christianity side by side through most of its history. In fact, prostitution remains in places like, well, the Netherlands and Nevada and all of these kinds of things. But the point is that Christians have already built into their traditions certain aspects of dealing with people who are oppositional or on the other side, and actually coming, spoiler alert, I'm continuing my way through 1 Corinthians, and when we get to the young man sleeping with his father's wife, and the Apostle Paul says, don't even associate with him. And then the Apostle Paul sort of says, well, I don't mean don't associate with evildoers who are outside of the church, don't associate with evildoers who are within the church. You can sort of begin to see again how these moralistic post-Protestant states, and which in some ways sort of replace Christendom, and this happens throughout, but especially after the Protestant Reformation, all of these issues sort of come to the fore, and they're now in play in now this sort of hyper church virtual world of social media, where we're sort of outsourcing our congregationalization.
We don't really know, what it's a real moral dilemma. I chose to put out a few pieces that were critical of Brett, that were critical of the way that he was going about things. I think increasingly he's now gone down a particular rabbit hole. He was just recently at a conference in Bath, which was hosted by Del Bigtree, old school anti-vaccine activist. Okay. The narrative of, oh, we're not criticizing vaccines, we're just criticizing these vaccines. Now, it's not true. The interesting narrative dynamic now is that the people who, now COVID is kind of going away as a live issue, where are the people who were sort of following that conspiratorial path going to go? Great Reset, WEF, Klaus Schwab, there's kind of conspiracy inflation that people like
these are good terms. Conspiracy inflation.
Majid Nawaz have already kind of gone further down, and it's like,
and Grim Grizz is like, conspiracy inflation, yes, more conspiracy, please.
People and they've encouraged a lot of people down that path, and I don't think that path's particularly helpful. I don't think it's my friend Jamie Wheel called it malevolent design. It's kind of this sort of sense of them. It's a psychological attractor. Sure. And it's a psychological attractor that I think stops people thinking. People should have equal skepticism of the narratives on both sides. And I think the problem with a lot of the
difficulty with equal is the same difficulty you had when there was one piece of cake and one cuts and the other selects. Equal is usually determined from the other side of the fork.
The heterodox contrarian space is that they were rightfully skeptical of the mainstream narratives and completely oblivious to the audience capture, to the commercial incentives. Commercial incentives on the conspiratorial side are huge, huge amounts of people who are donating to people who are following that, the whole conspirituality tendency during the pandemic.
Now the commercial incentives on the conspiratorial side are huge, and he's right. But that's an interesting dynamic. But the social upside on the thesis sides are also huge, because it's fascinating the way this is playing out. But again, you have this virtualization, intensification, this sort of hyper speed of it all in internet space.
Pandemic was a load of wellness influencers who realized that when they started sharing QAnon stuff, they got a lot more traction.
Right.
And so there's a huge attraction.
I think
that people don't seem to. Yeah.
And again, you deal with this in church. I remember when I was here just a couple of years, and they'd never had any small groups ministry here in this church. So we were rolling out a small group ministry program, and we were going to start 4 small groups. And I remember just certain members of my church, they had these great conspiracy theories about what was behind the new minister rolling out the small groups. And it's like, this is a church of 100 people here, folks. If we decided we were going to have a conspiracy, it wouldn't keep here for 10 minutes. But again, sort of out there in the big world, suspicion, conspiracy theories, these things are all going to go. And again, I'm not... not all conspiracy theories are wrong. The difficult thing is figuring out both how to do sort of the assessment of what's out there, and more importantly, what decisions will you make in terms of how you will live. Are you going to get the vaccine, or are you not going to get the vaccine? How are you going to treat those who get the vaccine? How are you going to treat those who don't get the vaccine? To what degree are you going to sort of ramp up your enemies of God narratives and then roll them out so that you can engage in what may be a very lucrative combat zone, which will get you all kinds of things that you want? It might be attention, it might be money, it might be status, all of these things, if you can sort of go out and play this game.
Yeah, the frustration I have, at least from the comments thread that I see, is just the naivety, just the lack of kind of...
You know, the poor sun. You need a little bit more sun there in the UK. You know, Dave, you got to get a tan on those legs. I'm just telling you. And again, I mean, I'm not really one to cast stones here, but just saying.
Willingness to challenge the narratives on both sides with equal skepticism.
I think the us versus them frame is massively selected for. It's a growth hack. I mean, it's like, if you can just...
And again, back to the church realm, Lyle Shaler, who was one of the very early church growth gurus. What a lot of people don't understand about church in the United States especially is that there is a massive industry studying church psychologically, demographically, sociologically, because there are a lot of incentives to get your church going and get your church growing, et cetera, et cetera. Countercultural churches always grow more. And that's why, and again, in this little virtualization hyper church space online, all of those dynamics are going to be true, and they're going to be even more so.
Just say
the little man willing to speak the truth against the kind of the big
people are
man
just
is...
so much more likely to share and to love it and to get enthusiastic if you can frame anything you're saying, if you can frame it as righteously opposed to some other entity or them.
And you know, let's not be let's not give the establishment a pass on that, because if you browse the catalog of Netflix, you will find movie after movie after movie after movie after movie about that, because this is a cultural trope and it has tremendous cultural power. It just does. And all of that's sort of like the warm water of the Caribbean, over which, if the wind blows right, you can get yourself a pretty good storm.
It will always get more traction. People will love it more. People will identify with it more. They'll get more excited. They'll be more likely to share. And I've seen that a lot, for sure. So, you know, it's interesting to think, you know, from your perspective, what do you think is the key to building viable media in this context, right? Because obviously you're taking a step back to think about these things because you see these pitfalls everywhere, and you're very sensitive to these things. But it sounds like you're still invested in media. You're thinking about building a production company. What do you think might be some leads? I know you don't have this all figured out yet, but what are some touchstones or some key ideas or bullet points for the future of independent media that somehow dodges all of these kind of biases and selection effects?
It's a really
It ain't gonna happen. You live with this stuff, and you figure out how to mitigate it, how to watch yourself, how to not fall into the traps and the holes. But these dynamics are far deeper and broader, and just what happened with social media, and that now, I mean, gatekeepers to one degree or another either weaponize this stuff or try to avoid this stuff.
really good question, because you can also look at something like Substack as a similar problem, because people on Substack, there's the same dynamic. They attract a certain audience. It's very sort of narrow casting. They then have to look for more and more content.
He's got such good words with this stuff. Narrow casting. It's not the first time I've heard it, but you say it. It'll take a little bit of repetition before it gets through my thick skull. It's like narrow casting. Oh yeah, that's. But because the internet is so huge, you can narrow cast and
content that feeds that particular audience, that particular narrative. I think that's been problematic as well. I think there are some people who do push back against their audience. I want to give a shout out to someone like Daniel Pinchbeck, who, despite being in a very kind of conspiratorial ecosystem, has taken stances that are unpopular with his audience. He's called out Russell Brand, for example, and I found him to have a lot of moral clarity over Ukraine and Russia, when a lot of the conspiratorial ecosystem was falling prey to a lot of like Russian propaganda and Putin's talking points. And so someone like that, I think individual curators or creators can still push back against the tide, but the tide's pretty intense in one direction.
Right.
The other thing, this is one of the questions that I have for whatever comes next after Rebel Wisdom, is that I was feeling a sort of sense of discomfort with some of the attractors. Like, part of the business model of Rebel Wisdom was obviously the courses that we were putting on. This never happened. Like, there was never a point where I was like, oh well, actually I need to be critical of John Bavecchio, I need to be critical of one of the people who's doing a course with us. But we could easily have had a course with Brett and Heather, for example. I did events with Brett and Heather like back in 2019. So we had
and again, back in the church thing, people have those reactions to dogma, but there's always differences in church. I mean, two colleagues, I sit with, say, one of my closest colleagues, and we'll do liturgy different, and we'll have, and you see this all the time in churches. Let's say you have a church that has, we're going to have a co-pastor model in our church. And it's really fun to have conversations with people who have worked the co-pastor model, because there's always stuff to differ over. And so figuring out who to invite, what to have, what to do, it's never easy.
Had those relationships, and I did feel like I was compelled to put out something that was critical of them, and did, but there could have been other business relationships. So how do you balance purely truth seeking with the incentive structures?
Right.
And also
and also, if you have, the better your relationship with the person, the broader, the more context outside, the easier it is to do criticism. The easier it is to say, well, my friend Sam doesn't believe in the Trinity. My friend Jacob has very ugly words to say about Paul of Tarsus. My friend, let's see, who else might I have some differences with? The political differences. My friend Bethel spits every time she hears the name Tim Keller. On and on and on and on and on. And when you're in a church, you live in the midst of all of these differences. And part of what happens in the church is that, because the church deals with what's ultimate, it's sort of like he's got a little a mixer there. It's like taking all the keys and putting them all up to the top. It's what happens in church. And so what you have to then do to learn is realize that how to have relationships despite significant differences. So I'm going to have this relationship with this individual who attacked a member of my church. I'm going to have a relationship with this individual who stole from me. I'm going to have a relationship with this individual who would like to steal the church building right out from under my congregation. And it all goes back again to Jesus, figuring out how exactly to best love your enemies. It's a really hard thing.
So the invisible incentive structures, particularly in the kind of heterodox space where people with big platforms don't get criticized by people within their own. Like, I think so many people are self-sacrificing and not saying things they know or they believe to be true.
Did I not criticize Jordan Peterson enough? Some of you will say yes. Some of you will say no. I thought I depending just on how too reactive people are, some people are thin-skinned that any criticism at all will sort of, that'll send them fleeing out of your church, and you very quickly figure out who those people are. And these are all tough. And then in your criticism, are you fair? That's so difficult. And again, part of what happens, so I just read 1 Corinthians 4 in this last week's sermon. I mean, Paul's in this conflict with the Corinthian church, a church that he founded and planted. And Paul's in conflict with them, and he basically says, finally, I'm not judged by you, I'm judged by God. And that can be a kind of a cheap and easy out. But in another way, it's also liberating, because I will be judged by many of you in all sorts of different ways, and downvote and unsubscribe, etc., etc. But finally, at least in a Christian frame, you act before an audience of one. And there's a degree of power in all of those traditions.
Because of the kind of social dynamics, because of the kind of feeling of, well, maybe if I criticize this person, I won't be able to get on their podcast again, or
right.
Like all of these different things, like what are the failure conditions in these ecosystems for truth seeking?
Such good words with this, failure conditions in the ecosystems. I mean, they're a little easier to understand than the fancy Vervaeke words.
That's something I think about a lot, and it's something I'd love to, whatever comes next for me, I'd love to build in some of this kind of mimetic protection from the beginning. And I don't quite know what that looks like. I think it has to be somehow probably user generated in terms of being funded by.
And actually, when I think about church structures, a lot of this stuff in many church structures has been built in. Even though churches get it wrong, churches have scandals, and Protestant churches, a lot of Protestant churches are sort of like, if you go up to farm equipment and there's all these guards, and like we're chipping, we had a chipper that we rented, and Roger says to us, yeah, under this thing there's all these blades, so we're not going to open that. And then halfway through the day the chipper's off and the thing is up, and they're trying to get the stuff out, and it's like, well, again, there goes our concern about caution of all those sharp blades under that chipper. And then I took a picture and put it on Twitter of Roger like neck deep into the chipper. It's like, and a lot of Protestant churches basically take all those guards off and says, what could go wrong? Let's just keep chipping away. Older churches usually say, well, we're going to be a little careful. But again, just like with all of those kinds of things, you have to have this balance between, you can't be so cautious that you're always worried about anything and then nothing gets done. At the same time, you don't want to be, a lot of the shape of my channel and the decisions that I've made with respect to this channel are because of reasons like this. I mean, at this point still, I derive the vast majority of my income from my church, and I often tell people if they'd like to support this, you find the link below, especially if they're American taxpayers. your contributions to Living Stones are tax deductible. And so I'll tell people, if you like what I'm doing, support the church, because the church has been supporting me. Now, if in fact the church goes under and I have to adopt a new model, I'll be subject to all sorts of these kinds of things, and I'll deal with those struggles when I come upon them. But that isn't to say that there aren't lots of temptations and struggles with all the sorts of things that even just the small amount of celebrity and opportunity that this channel has afforded me presents before me.
Either bigger or smaller people who are able to kind of empower you to follow stuff, but you've got to be careful that you don't select for an audience that is pushing you in a particular direction.
Right.
Are there enough people who kind of value nuance, value kind of you following wherever the kind of uncomfortable exploration will lead? And I don't know. I'm really more and more aware of all of the different factors that handicap pure truth seeking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it sounds like you're still favorable to crowdfunding. Like you're not. It sounds like you're not ready to give up on that yet. You still see that as a net positive in terms of relative to
churches have been doing crowdfunding since the first century.
Traditional, the way that traditional media would be funded. It sounds like your impression is that crowdfunding is still better than the old world. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so.
But you think it sounds like you think the quality control or the problems, the mimetic protection, to use your excellent phrase, comes in more at the level almost of selecting who comes in or who
it depends.
It's for.
Yeah, crowdfunding is fine depending on who the crowd is.
Yeah.
Because crowdfunding can also, like for example.
So now you're getting into, crowdfunding at church. Churches will take money from anyone, but it's usually the membership. Well, why do churches restrict their membership? Well, why do you have, say, dogmatic requirements or behavioral requirements for membership of church? This is exactly the kinds of reasons you have them.
Well, I think Dave Rubin, the Dave Rubin trajectory is really fascinating. And if anyone hasn't watched the Timber on Toast series about Dave Rubin, Dave Rubin's Battle of Ideas, have you seen that?
No.
You have to watch it.
So give us the TLDR on Rubin's
It's 4 hours
trajectory.
of Rubin's trajectory from, hey, I think there's a problem with when he did this. I think his first interview was with Sam Harris, where he was just sort of leaving the Young Turks and being like, hey, I think there's a problem with intolerance on the left.
Yeah.
I'm a liberal. To then basically having Milo Yiannopoulos on, realizing that the anti-woke thing was getting all of the views and getting more and more extreme. Up to in 2020, he was basically kind of QAnon light, saying Trump's got something. He basically full-on Trump apologist at the time of kind of January the 6th, pretty much.
I feel like I don't hear about him that much anymore. I'm sure he's still kicking, but what? Yeah, I mean, what?
I think he's increasingly culturally irrelevant, but he was culturally relevant for a while because he was cohering a conversation in this very interesting space at the beginning of the whole IDW movement. But I think he was always pretending to be something that he wasn't.
Right.
In a way, now that he's a full-on Republican advocate, I think he's less there's less of a problem now because I think he's identifying himself as what he is. But for a while, he was just like, I'm just interested in ideas. I'm just following the ideas wherever they lead, and it wasn't true. It was always in a particular direction. But anyway, the reason I mention that is because I'm pretty sure that it's his audience, the Patreon audience, and the people who are basically funding him to make the program, who were the radicalizing factor, because they were attracted for that kind of strong anti-woke angle. And I feel I know that because when Rebel Wisdom first came along, we had a couple of people in our sort of supporter Patreon community who were also funding Dave Rubin, and they were the sort of like red meat anti-woke stuff. Then over time we attracted a different audience, many of whom have got a background in things like integral theory or developmental thinking, and they were much more comfortable with kind of nuance and more less strident. So I think it's possible to create an audience that is not pulling you too far in that direction, whereas if you start doing stuff about conspiracy...
You're creating your audience. It's not unlike planting and building a church. Except, of course, an audience is way out there, and there's churn. In a church, it's much more life on life.
Or if you start doing stuff about kind of vaccines, you are going to attract a particular audience, and I've got a friend who their friends of theirs, basically wellness influencers who did go down the conspirituality route, found their followings like 50x or 100x during the pandemic. But he was saying, like, on one side he's kind of jealous of them, but on another side he's like, that audience will eat them alive if they now kind of in any way backtrack from the positions that they've been.
Did you just use the word conspirituality?
Yeah.
Oh, I haven't heard that. Okay, but
Another great word.
It makes obvious sense to me when you say it.
Conspiracy and spirituality.
Sure.
Which is a huge...
Because a lot of the conspiracy theories are pseudo-religious in a way.
Yeah, there's that, but it's more that spirituality and wellness influencers became increasingly conspiratorial during the pandemic.
Oh, okay.
And there's an overlap. It's a little rabbit hole, but there's a big overlap and a vulnerability in the spiritual community, because the spiritual community's got a lot of, The Secret, the whole kind of like imagine magical thinking of just if you positive visualizations, creating your own reality.
Yep.
And so in a way, it's like already a positive conspiracy thinking.
Yeah,
And even though I now and then, because I believe in the resurrection, get accused of magical thinking and things like this, again, in the church community, because you have, in many ways, a diversity of beliefs, and these beliefs are in competition, they're against each other, on and on and on, you actually have a lot of checks in against that conspirituality. What a great word. David's just got a lot of good words to give us today.
Right. And it doesn't take much before it flips into the kind of opposite of that.
Right.
Kind of like the disempowering version of everything's arranged, everything is kind of organized, everything is, instead of it being a positive conspiracy, it's a negative one.
Right.
So yeah, there's a great podcast called Conspirituality where they explore it in depth.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It makes perfect sense, right?
Oh, I haven't heard. And a podcast thing, conspirituality. I'll look it up a sec. Yep, there it is, conspirituality. Very interesting.
Right, because that's basically the pros and cons of high openness, right? The disadvantages, apophania, and if you're open-minded, that's really great. You can be exposed to truths that other people aren't willing to see. You can also subscribe to just falsehoods that are actually just randomness. Yeah. So yeah, interesting. So okay, let's talk about a little bit of some of.
I was going to change the subject, but this was part of the conversation I wanted to highlight and sort of. It's a really healthy thing to keep in mind. A little bit later they'll talk about, but maybe I should jump a little bit ahead to where they go.
Things that you're thinking about right now.
Yeah, I'm interested in potentially a production company,
right.
Like maybe going back into trying to kind of make pieces for the mainstream. Like I think a lot of these topics that particularly featured on Rebel Wisdom, like the existential risk and the kind of the deeper kind of philosophical topics, I'd love to see if there's a possibility of getting those onto like BBC or Netflix, but knowing there's an ambivalence there, because I know what a massive fucking ball ache it is to go through all of those different. The amazing thing about YouTube is that you record it,
a ball ache. Half of you, well, according to my Google Analytics, 90% of you will be able to relate to that.
Put it out straight away. The flip side is that you don't necessarily get so many eyeballs, you don't have the same level of credibility that you do as you go through the kind of the hoops to get it onto mainstream or legacy media. Legacy media, there's so many different kind of gatekeepers, there's so many different conversations you have to have, there's so much it's so intense. Like documentary making is incredibly intense, and I'm like, do I really want to kind of have to go through those hoops again? I don't know. It's an idea. I mean, I do feel like there's an opportunity to start shifting. Yeah, I do.
But this is, of course, the opposite, the flip side of the whole business, where you have this mainstream where. Well, the mainstream is never neutral. It's always deeply embedded in whatever the spirit of the age is.
I think there's an opportunity for some of these topics to be kind of picked up by legacy now, but I'm also kind of ambivalent as to whether that whether that's particularly my job to do or not.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if you know Alex Moyer by any chance. She's
No.
doing a documentary on Alex Jones right now.
Mm.
She's done a couple controversial, provocative documentaries, and I'm pretty close friends with her. She lives here in Austin, and yeah, I get to see that from behind the scenes. It's like doing a mainstream documentary through the traditional kind of production and distribution systems. It's a crazy minefield, and it's like you have to jump through so many hoops, and you have to make sure so many people sign off on it that if you want to do anything provocative, it's like, I mean, I really respect actually people who are willing to go through those trials and tribulations, because it's a lot of waiting, it's a lot of negotiating, and it's a lot of like really having to fight for what you want to do, and get the right people on board, and you're always in fear that it's going to fall through or something like that. It's so, but then like you said, the benefit is you if you succeed, you get your work dropped to a larger audience, right?
And it also becomes a thing that, because it has the kind of the BBC or the Netflix name on it, it becomes
The imprimatur.
something that can actually shift the conversation. You will get it picked up. You will find that people write articles about it. It can become actually a cultural moment.
It can make like a more concentrated splash.
David, I write articles about your films.
Seems, right? Because you can build a YouTube channel to be really big, right? And it's like maybe in sheer number of total eyeballs, maybe it probably get up there to be comparable or whatever. But it's definitely more of a diffused thing, right? To grow a big YouTube channel and do internet documentaries independently. You might be able to match it in some absolute terms, but it's definitely more. It's a much longer slog, a slower slog. Whereas if you can get that documentary placed with the right production company and the right distribution and the right people on board, you can make it drop in the culture like a nuclear bomb, right? That's kind of what we're getting at, isn't it? So you still think about wanting to do, you kind of look back at that model with some interest.
Yeah, I mean the other flip side of the massive ball ache is that if you're working with a good team and you're working with a good exec producer and commissioner, it does make it better. Like
right.
With the films that I was making before, particularly Unreported World, they were incredibly hard work, incredibly kind of debilitating and stressful, and like crazy hours. But I would say that, and incredibly kind of difficult process, and like lots of feedback of like you'd get changes to it that you're just like, oh shit, like that.
But they're genuinely adding value. A lot of that is,
some of it isn't, but some of it is. Value. Most
right.
of it was adding value. But I've also been on projects where the feedback that you get is just so off that you still have to do it, and then one bad commissioner or one bad sort of set of someone who's having an off day and then comes up with some changes to the program that you just think are not make no sense, then suddenly you're like, I've spent like weeks of my life, months of my life doing this, and I feel like you've just ruined it. So you also get that dynamic as well.
Right.
So I thought that little section was good too. So yeah, I really appreciated this section, legs and all, and so someone's going to be when I did this commentary on Peterson right at the beginning of the second wave, and he was at like Oxford Union or something like that, and there's that security guard girl who sat next to him that I kept getting distracted with. So sorry about that, Rabbit. But yeah, let me know what you think. I think these are really important issues, and the fact that it's funny how we get these tiny little hyper churches out there in social media, and the parallels that they have to religion and churches and communities and these kinds of dynamics that have been around a very long time, I find quite interesting. So let me know what you think. Leave a comment.